Okay, so for the next presentation, I'm delighted to introduce Dominic Pivonka from AbbVie, who is responsible for market access for drugs, and I think it's going to give another very important perspective on how drugs get to market and from a pharma perspective. So I'll hand over to Dominic, who's going to go through his presentation, and then we'll have some questions.
Thank you, Adrian. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dominic Pivonka, and I'm going to be giving a pharmaceutical industry perspective on getting new medicines into the clinic. I work for AbbVie, and my role is focused on enabling patient access to our new medicines. So to start with, I'll just say a few words about AbbVie. AbbVie is a global biopharmaceutical company. We're committed to developing medicines for some of the world's most complex and critical conditions. Today, our medicines help 52 million people across 175 countries, and we're making significant advancements with a strong pipeline of potential new medicines. So I've said AbbVie is a global company, but we also invest heavily in the UK and work with the NHS, leading universities and other research bodies, as well as commercial and non-profit organisations. For example, AbbVie has invested over £50 million in UK clinical trial activity since 2014, and we've provided funding of $10 million to help the UK Biobank to drive sequencing of genetic data. And AbbVie's UK investment goes beyond our medicines, with the organisation making substantial donations to charities, patient organisations and academic institutions. So before we go into detail, I just wanted to set out the scale of the challenge in terms of getting new medicines into the clinic. There are numerous stages a medicine must go through before it's available for patients. Each of these steps is challenging and can be very time-consuming. And certainly in the early stages, there's little guarantee of success. So these stages range from the initial discovery, development and testing of medicines through to the appraisal by the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence on clinical and cost effectiveness, and negotiations between the NHS and pharmaceutical companies to agree prices. And I'll touch on each of these stages in turn to give an industry perspective. So the process of discovery and development is complex and may take decades. Drug discovery is the first step in the process. It starts with screening chemical compounds or biological molecules that have the potential to become treatments. And with recent advancements in technology, we're now able to screen these compounds faster than ever before. This stage often involves collaboration between industry and research organisations, all coming together to find a potential medicine. Drug discovery can take 4 to 5 years, and there's very low chance of success for any individual compound. So an average of 10,000 will need to be considered for every new medicine that eventually becomes available. But despite the low chances of success and long timelines, it's worth reflecting on the enormous success of global efforts over many decades in terms of medicines, vaccines, and other health technologies that have lengthened and improved people's lives. So since the 1960s, medicines and vaccines have helped increase life expectancy by more than 10 years, turned HIV/AIDS from a death sentence to a manageable disease, and made strides in eradicating malaria. And we're now seeing advanced therapies treating and curing more diseases, including cancers. So turning to clinical trials, this is to determine whether a medicine works and is safe. And every medicine routinely used in the NHS must be tested in a clinical trial. So trials are divided into different stages, which we call phases. Early phase trials look at whether a medicine is safe, and later phase trials aim to test whether a new medicine is better than existing treatments. So once the 3 phases of the clinical trials are complete, pharmaceutical companies must present the data to regulatory authorities to determine whether the drug can be marketed and sold in the country. In the UK, the relevant bodies are the MHRA and currently the European Medicines Agency. Within these agencies, a team of doctors and other scientists reviews the company's data, and they consider whether the treatment improves outcomes for people with the relevant condition compared to the alternative treatment, and whether the benefits of taking it outweigh the risks. For the moment, until the end of the year, the UK is still part of the EU's regulatory system, and the government will need to set out its approach to marketing authorisation once the UK has left the EU. So once a medicine has been approved by the regulator, in the UK, medicines will undergo health technology assessment, or HTA, by one of the UK HTA bodies. In England, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE, is the HTA body which decides which medicines and other treatments should be made available on the NHS. Wales and Northern Ireland will generally follow NICE, but in Scotland, the decision maker is the Scottish Medicines Consortium, or SMC. I'll be focusing on the process in England over the next few slides, but there are commonalities between NICE and the SMC. Both these bodies assess the clinical and cost effectiveness of medicines. Cost effectiveness analysis involves weighing up the costs and benefits of an intervention to determine if it is a worthwhile investment for the NHS. And some of you will be aware of the Cancer Drugs Fund. This is an England-specific programme which gives access to promising new treatments while companies collect further evidence to address areas of clinical uncertainty. So I'll say a few words about the NICE process from an industry perspective. NICE reviews all new medicines launched in the UK or the use of existing medicines for new diseases. NICE has established processes and methodology for assessing medicines, and it involves a range of interested stakeholders in reaching its conclusions. The assessment of new medicines can be thought of as following a three-stage process: scoping, assessment, and appraisal, and companies have an important role to play in all three steps. In the scoping phase, the specific question that needs to be addressed is defined. For example, defining the relevant population and the existing treatments to compare the new medicine against. In the assessment phase, an independent academic group evaluates the evidence submission from the company. We've discussed clinical trials, which are important evidence, but NICE and other HTA bodies will require further information than is available from a single trial programme. For example, for a NICE submission, we need to compare a new medicine with treatments currently used in the NHS, and they may not have been available at the time of the clinical trial design. Or we may need to look at evidence over a much longer time period than a clinical trial allows. And we'll certainly need to include specific NHS resources and costs to understand the cost effectiveness of a new medicine. In the final phase, an appraisal committee meets to consider all the evidence. Companies participate in the meeting to answer any questions on the data, and the committee ultimately decides if the new medicine should be funded on the basis of representing value for money for the NHS. Since NICE was established more than 20 years ago, there has been considerable focus on the value for money that medicines provide. And the scrutiny that new medicines undergo is unlike that of any other area of healthcare expenditure. If NICE recommends a new medicine, NHS England is then tasked with funding that new medicine, routinely within 90 days of the decision, although access is usually much quicker for cancer treatments. NHS England also plays a key role in negotiating with companies, and this may involve developing a commercial agreement. For example, if the medicine has a substantial budget impact, NHS England may engage in negotiations with companies to mitigate the impact of the initial launch of the medicine. Alongside working with NICE to establish the cost effectiveness and the NHS England to mitigate the budget impact of new medicines, the industry has worked with the UK government to agree the voluntary scheme to ensure predictability and affordability for branded medicines. The voluntary scheme has taken a number of different forms over the years, and the latest scheme, called the Voluntary Scheme for Branded Medicines Pricing and Access, came into effect at the beginning of 2019. And what it does is it caps the growth in NHS sales of branded medicines to no more than 2% in each of the 5 years of the scheme. So essentially, it provides the government with certainty on what it will spend for the entire medicines bill for the NHS until the end of 2023. To summarise, the process of getting new medicines into the clinic can be long and complex, and there are inevitably many failures along the way. However, the successes seen over the years have provided enormous gains in terms of improving and lengthening people's lives. But before medicines can reach NHS patients, they must first be passed by the regulator, who considers their benefits and risks, and they must then demonstrate cost effectiveness with NICE, in addition to those budget control agreements just discussed.
So, Dominic, thanks ever so much for the presentation. That was really interesting to see from a pharma perspective about how things get to market, and particularly with the close interaction between what you do and then working with the regulators, working with NICE and the funders. I'm going to start with a sort of a slightly confrontational question, but I mean, it's something that does come up in terms of, just why is it that new drugs cost so much money?
Thank you, Adrian. No, I think it's a good question, and one that does come up. Probably what I'd say is the process of discovery, development, and ultimately approval takes a really long time. It's complex, it's uncertain, and ultimately it's very costly. I mean, every year companies like AbbVie put hundreds of billions of pounds into new research and development, and that's more than any other industry. And despite many failures, some of these medicines and vaccines will ultimately transform the lives of NHS patients in the future. But without that ongoing investment, the pipeline of new medicines would eventually come to an end. It's probably also worth saying that in the UK, medicines must demonstrate cost effectiveness before they can be used in the NHS. So new medicines approved by NICE represent value for money. That means they are worth the investment.
Okay, so coming back to sort of a UK question then, I mean, looking at this is that from a company perspective, how do you decide which drugs you wish to bring into the UK market? Is it all of them? Is it none of them? I guess that one of the things that there can be a frustration when we look at this, say, from a clinician and a patient perspective, is I see a new treatment that can be as available to people in other sectors, particularly in the US. I'm mindful of the fact that, of course, there are different funding arrangements, but how is it that you make that decision about how we get drugs for patients in this country?
There's a number of steps that we've got to go through first. The first, in terms of approval, is the regulatory approval. So that's to ensure that the risk-benefit balance is positive. And so that's where bodies like the European Medicines Agency and the MHRA have a role. And it's true that there sometimes can be differences between regulators in different countries in terms of which treatments are approved and which are not. The next step is obviously around, in the UK, is around health technology assessment. So that's really looking at the clinical and cost effectiveness of medicines. But you can see, as a result of the different institutions and the different processes that operate in different countries, that there can arise differences in terms of what's available on the NHS and what's available in other countries.
So coming back to sort of changing subject slightly to clinical trials, which are clearly a large part of what you do in the pharmaceutical industry, one of the frustrations I would say as a clinician is that sometimes getting trials into the UK, that we see trials that are done in the States, done in other parts of Europe, they don't necessarily come here, which is something we'd like to be in a position whereby we're doing things at the cutting edge, also being able to offer this to patients. So how do you make the decisions broadly as a company about where it is that you do trials and what makes that decision? And
yeah, that's a really good question. And I think as an industry, we're really supportive of the UK as being a leading beacon, I suppose, in terms of life sciences. I think it's probably worth reflecting that the UK is one of the leading countries for clinical research. And just in terms of recent events, we've seen how the UK has responded to COVID-19. And I think we've seen that the life sciences sector, government and regulators have really worked very closely together to make that happen. So I would say that the collaboration is something that's very important in terms of the UK being a leading light in terms of clinical research.
So I think just coming back to trials in terms of timelines, that one of the one concern is that in patients in trials that sometimes they don't show benefit, sometimes they do show benefit. It can then take quite a long time before that actually translates into access. Can that be sped up at all, or is it just a factor of all the hoops that you have to jump through?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been some advancements, particularly around the drug discovery stage in recent years, to get through that process more quickly. But ultimately, the whole process of discovery and development does take a long time, and I think about 12 years on average from research lab to the patient. In terms of the proportion of clinical trials which then subsequently become available for patients, there's not a great deal of data, and I think a recent study in the US put it around 14% of all drugs in clinical trials eventually were approved for patients. But I think these rates vary depending on the therapy area, and in the hardest areas of innovation, like cancer, for example, it can be around 3%.
One of the challenges we have with dealing with blood cancers is that many of these are rare diseases. And so this can be a challenge in terms of how we identify new drugs. And I guess it's a challenge for the industry because there's a balance between meeting the needs of patients, advancing science, and also a financial consideration. How do you balance that off in terms of being able to, you're a company that wishes to make money, but also to ensure that we're meeting the needs of patients with rare disorders?
I think ultimately where companies focus their efforts, I mean, it does relate to that high unmet need. So that's probably the key consideration for industry more generally. Individual companies have specific areas of expertise and areas of focus. The consideration, I think, of profit in many respects is secondary to the unmet need in the area of the company focus. And I think what really triggers the investments in terms of discovery and development is the point at which researchers find out about a particular mechanism of disease. And that's really where the investment and the focus on that particular disease really starts to flow, and where we start the whole process of discovery and development.
Dominic, many thanks for joining us and for your time and insights into this. We'll finish there.
Thank you, Adrian.